watching Channel Africa Conversations.
So for me, I see you'll have more more disputes around elections, and you'll have more violence also that comes out of those elections. But yes, there will be surprises probably in Gabon. We won't see what I used to call in the name of the father and the son and the cousin. I don't think General Nguema in Gabon will want to come back as the cousin of the Bongo family.
Hello and welcome to Channel Africa Conversations. I'm Peter Ndoro. 2024 was quite a year for Africa, with several significant stories that shaped the continent in one way or another. From youth-led protests in Kenya to a number of ongoing conflicts, elections, and the consequences of climate change. So what lies ahead for the continent in 2025? Will some of the issues of 2024 find resolution? And what else might develop given the growing calls for change by the continent's youth? Well, will we be a step closer to silencing the guns? And will Africa's influence increase as South Africa leads the G20? Well, to help us unpack all of this, we're now joined by South African researcher and academic from the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at the University of South Africa, Adv Sipho Mantula. Thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Asante sana,
as you always say, Jambo, Asante.
Jambo, brother Peter, right. To your viewers.
So 2024 was quite a year, and I want to start there because it'll help us kind of think where we might pick up for 2025. And for me, one of the most important voices that started to have voice was the youth. And we saw them, it looked ostensibly as if they were demonstrating against issues of the day, but one got a sense quite quickly that actually they were talking about the state of the continent in general, the state of their countries in general, and that change is something that they're really desperate for. Tell me about that and how you think the continent will look this year overall based on that theme.
No, correct, Brother Peter. What we have picked up in 2024, we saw it with the elections in Senegal, the rise of Faye and Ousmane Sonko. We saw it in South African elections when you had independent candidates who were young people. We saw it in Kenya with young people protesting on issues of bread and butter, what you call taxation. We saw it in the Sahel region with the military generals who are now defying France. We saw it in South Africa once more again towards the end of the year when we are assuming this G20 role to be part of the global economic framework. For me, it's also a contradiction of the Berlin Conference of 140 years, that 2024 also represent the arrest and the capture of Africa. And the members of the G20 were former colonizers. And secondly, when I look at the youth, for me, it's not all about youth leadership, but the youth were raising fundamental issues. And that's what we are seeing in Mozambique now, when you have to now look at Mozambique with another eagle view or a third eye view. To say Mozambique, the youth of Mozambique are now revolting against the liberation movement. And maybe finally I'll say, I see the youth of Namibia, who were part of SWAPO, becoming independent candidates. Your Bernard Swartboy, your Job Amapunda. These were youth leaders of SWAPO, moving away from the liberation movement and contesting power. So I don't think the youth have been only talking about economic change, but they were also contesting political power. And correctly so, as you said, they've also been questioning the global order. From the Sahel to West Africa to East Africa also. We saw the rise of many young people in Ethiopia, many young people in Somalia. And I think that's how we should always look at that. For 2025, it will still be the same, what I call frequency of the young people's energy. That Mozambique, the young people, they are still on the street as we are speaking now. The young people in Kenya are back on the street again. The young people of South Africa will be back on the street come 2025 and 2026 for the local government elections. So you can see that there will always be those issues that will emanate from the youth challenges and youth opportunities, because I don't think we have to focus on challenges of the youth, but what are the strengths and opportunities of this youth revolution?
Okay, so in and amongst all of that, you spoke about elections. There will be more elections in 2025. Do you think that they will bring surprises that we saw in 2024 as well?
Absolutely, but worried about West Africa with Paul Biya, Cameroon, whether will the old man still want to go back to the State House? Mutharika in Malawi, and even Joyce Banda, as well as Chakwera. I see the post-electoral violence that might arise in some of the countries, probably Tanzania is going for the elections. Samia Sulu has been having challenges with the opposition there. I've also picked that in the Sahel you have Gabon, and then you have CAR, you have Burkina Faso, you have Burundi in the Great Lakes. So this is interesting that the super election year of 2024, it moves to 2025. But for me is that elections, it is not all about political power, Brother Pete. It's also economic empowerment of the citizens. I think we have to move from this notion that elections is a ritual only for political power. Elections represent democracy. Election must represent governance and must represent the rule of law. Bit worried about the independence of judiciary, that judges are also being pushed to adjudicate electoral disputes. We had 2 disputes that were hanging now since 2024 going to 2025. Mozambique Constitutional Council judgment is being questioned. It cannot be appealed anywhere else. Namibia is having a presidential dispute, So you can see South Africa had many disputes actually before elections, even post-elections. So for me, I see you will have more more disputes around elections, and you'll have more violence also that comes out of those elections. But yes, there will be surprises probably in Gabon. We won't see what I used to call in the name of the father and the son and the cousin. I don't think General Nguema in Gabon will want to come back as the cousin of the Bongo family.
So, there's so many things that I'm concerned about. And I just wonder, France has had an enormous influence on the continent. We've just seen now Ivory Coast, one of its best friends, sever ties with their military. With these elections that are coming through, we do have a number of Francophone countries. Do you think that that's going to change the tone of the elections? Because for a long time, France had its hand in some of the outcomes.
Absolutely, but remember the France foreign policy, it will not exist without Africa. And this has been said by the former president of France before, when he said that the foreign policy of France is reliant solely on the African continent, and particularly in their former colonial states, which is the Sahel region and West Africa. You are correct to raise the issue of Ouattara pulling the French military out of Ivory Coast, but he might be following the trend that we see from the Sahel, that Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso have served their ties with the former colonizers, because this question of that our military need capacity building, I think South Africa has been doing that, Nigeria has been doing that, Kenya has been doing that, Rwanda has been doing that. I think for us, it's our military intelligence and knowledge that we need to ask ourselves, were these peacekeepers keeping peace in Africa? Or were they looting Africa? Or they were a proxy? And that question goes back to what happened in Ivory Coast. If you remember, the former president Thabo Mbeki was shunned, was being rebuked to say, but you don't understand the Francophone dynamics. Why you want to become the mediator here? So one still foresee that France is losing currency, its foreign policy is losing currency in the Sahel region, and Russia is emerging, and China. And France, one can say that is just rebooting its military operations in Africa. I don't think France will leave Africa or will leave the West Africa or the Sahel region. And it is the same like the US, the same like the UK, the British, the EU. All these regional bodies and superpowers, they are always having appetite on the African continent, Brother Peter. And that comes from the natural resources that Africa it still have.
Yeah, that's the bottom line, and that we are not beneficiating them. So, Togo, I wonder what the next chapter is going to look like. And lessons learned, Gabon, where we had the countries run almost as family businesses, where the father hands over to the son. Where's Togo going?
Togo, it is the same issue of the dynasty, of in the name of the father, the son, and the cousin, and the daughter, and the brother. But for me, is that Togo is going for the elections next month, in February. They are the ones who are actually laying the path for the elections in West Africa. And remember, Togo represent what I called in the African continent, one of the countries that experienced the first military coup. So when you think of Togo, it has behaved so far. But some of the first military coups in the early 60s, they can be traced back to Lome, to Togo. And that's where you also have that a treaty of the AU that talks about military coups that comes from Togo. So for me, it's the family that has to move away from personalizing power. It has to go back to the civilians. We need multi-party democracy in West Africa. And I think this notion of military getting into state, the families getting into state, derails development. And that undermines economic growth. And that also threatens regional stability. And Togo might also be a headache to ECOWAS. ECOWAS is trying by all means to convince the 3 rebel member states to come back. So for me, the politics of Togo and their elections, I still feel that the dynasty, the family will come back. And that's the same script that we are seeing even in Cameroon.
So, you mentioned coups. We've now seen Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso almost produce a blueprint of how to stage one and survive, to a point that ECOWAS feels a little bit powerless to deal with them. Might this embolden other military outfits on the continent?
I don't think so, but partly one can say that, as I talk about Gabon, I thought Gabon will be influenced by the 3 Sahelian states. And now ECOWAS, which I normally joke, I say it become ECO-East now, because out of 16 member states, you have 13 now surviving. And now from the 3 member states who have pulled out, ECOWAS has tried to use fire as a mediator to deal with the young military generals, and which I think that strategy, it doesn't work out. They've given the 3 military generals until July to can reconsider their coming back to ECOWAS, and I don't think so. For me, the main issue is the building of the regional economic viability of ECOWAS to function, for them to deal with the counter-terrorism that is in the Sahel region because of its natural resources. And secondly, I think other military generals might not follow. If you look at Uganda, you look at Rwanda, they've not been following ECOWAS template, But when you look at Gabon, you look at Guinea-Conakry, you look at Guinea-Bissau, which also you must understand, Guinea-Bissau had also attempted military coups. You look at Congo, DRC also. You have military issues that have been arising between Katumbi, Tshisekedi, as well as Kabila. Those are the issues that I don't think we might say that it might rise in the SADC region, but in West Africa, it might give them a template to say, but the 3 Sahelian generals have made it.
All right, let's talk about spillovers, conflicts that need resolution. Let's start with Mozambique. And I think maybe even Namibia. I mean, it could be actually that SWAPO did win. And they need to find a way to convince the people that are complaining. Mozambique is not so clear, one thinks. So is there going to be a resolution? We've got Mondlane saying he's going to install himself president on the 15th.
That reminds me, if you remember, Brother Pete, if your memory serves well, if you remember the time of Tshisekedi, Etienne Tshisekedi and Kabila, claiming that we are going to inaugurate on the same day. For me, is that the spillover. What you are raising, I spoke to one intelligent officer actually this morning about the same question, that the post-electoral violence in Mozambique will definitely have a spillover to the region. Even if Philip Nyusi says that we don't need mediation, a mediation can come from your neighbor, can be regional, so you need regional mediation. Constitutional Council has passed, now you need to move to another stage. The second aspect is that when you lodge an electoral dispute, you need to have evidence and facts, and you need to accept the outcome. But Mozambique has a history of armed conflict, first of all. Secondly, it has corruption of the current liberation movement, Frelimo. That also exacerbates the youth anger and the youth agony or the youth rebellion that is in Mozambique. I was privileged to be in Mozambique just before elections, and I picked up the youth sentiments. And the youth sentiments are, they have lost faith in liberation movements. It's not all about elections, it's about socio-economic challenges and economic opportunities. And that's where we find Mozambique is going to spill to the region. Sudan cannot leave Sudan. It is a country that has been in war since 2023, in April. And it has been erased in the global media debates. Eastern DRC, it has been a serious issue. The Sahel, they've been jihadist and counterterrorism. So for me, the three countries beyond Russia and Ukraine, Middle East, Syria, all those global conflicts, when I look at their lens, last year when we had our peace and security dialogue with the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and other key people, we were focusing on the Horn of Africa. We were focusing on Sudan. And we said, but come 2025, we need to focus on the Sahel. But I insisted that we need to follow through of the previous dialogue we had on the Horn of Africa. Where are we sitting? We have a simmering conflict between Ethiopia, Somalia, and Somaliland. Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia on the Great Renaissance Dam. So, and then you have the Eastern DRC, Rwanda and DRC, and Uganda, what I call the Africa First World War I. Actually, that created more death. So conflict resolution will not give economic growth in the continent. So long as we don't arrest the issues of conflict and insecurity in the continent, we cannot talk about economic development or prosperity to the whole continent. Whether we are on G20, we are on G7, G77, whether and Africa is still indebted, by the way, Brother Peter. I think one of the issues that even if we are dealing with conflict resolution, we are still in debt of how do we deal with the international debt. At the same time, we have conflict in many countries. Mozambique, the EU throw money to Rwanda, but they don't throw money on dealing with the post-electoral crisis. For me, it is questionable, but probably is how EU foresee Cabo Delgado, which is where natural gas come from, and we might need it as South Africa. If this conflict persists, we might not even get the gas in South Africa because Sasol has pulled out for now because there's a conflict that's happening in that country.
Talking about Cabo Delgado, because some of these insurgencies ride like waves, and there's a time we forget that there's still a problem. Cabo Delgado, you've mentioned.
Yeah.
Nigeria is not free
Absolutely.
from insurgency.
Yeah.
It may not be being reported. Is this going to increase in 2025, the problem of terrorism, insurgency?
No, I think it will, considering that Nigeria is next to Niger, it's next to Burkina Faso. But the Jagaban, the current president, as they call him, Bola Tinubu, he has been struggling, and he has been, just recently I saw that he's been accused of corruption. Now, Bola Tinubu is struggling also with ECOWAS chairpersonship, how to deal with the Sahel question. Secondly, he failed also to deal with the labor unrest that was seen in that country in 2024. The labor unrest is all about the issues around the fuel subsidies, the issue of the Naira, the strength of the Naira. So I think for you probably to remind of the Zimbabwean dollar. When you think of the Naira now having challenges, it's like the question of Zimbabwean dollar, being attacked by the foreign bankers. It's the same like Nigeria as a superpower in the African region. It will always be challenged by the question of the oil question, the issue of corruption, and the issue of Bola Tinubu dealing with corruption within his government. Because the issue of Bola Tinubu, when he's been named as a corrupt person, is because he has not dealt with corruption within different states and different ministers. And that's where Nigeria will also be a threat for 2025. Despite that, it wants to join the BRICS as a partner, just like Uganda. Nigeria will have to think twice to strengthen its role in ECOWAS and to strengthen its national interest.
Let's talk a little bit about the African Union theme, which is designated in 2025 Justice for Africans and People of African Descent through Reparations. This is something that we've talked about and cried about for decades.
Absolutely.
We've had former colonial leaders visit the continent. To even acknowledge some of their atrocities was a hard ask. Slowly but surely we're getting apologies, but are we going to see reparations?
You know, this is a very interesting debate. It reminds me of the World Conference Against Racism that was in this country. The question of global reparations came very sharp from the African diaspora. That's why you had organizations like Global African Congress, many Pan-Africanist movement in Global North, as well as in the Caribbean. You will understand that Jamaicans, Rastafarians, the Pan-Africanists, this question of reparations, they've been talking about it in different levels. And this theme is very important considering what we've been talking about so far, from West Africa to East Africa to Southern Africa. The question of reparations goes also to the damage that was caused by the former colonizers. And also beyond the damage of the former colonizers, the issue of repairing is an international law principle. It's not just compensation. When you talk of reparation, you repair the damage. You look at 30 years of South Africa and you say, but was there reparations after apartheid? You say, no, there was no reparations. It was just mere peanuts. The former President Thabo Mbeki tried to create a TRC fund at the Justice Department in the presidency. Maladministration there. And the monies of reparations are not monies for infrastructure development. We should not confuse that with that. That you come to the community and say, okay, we are here to repair the infrastructure. No, you need to rebuild the lives of nation states that have been exploited, raped, and even exploited. Like you think of DRC. It has been in war since 1960. Lumumba was killed. There was no reparations for the people of DRC. You look at the question of the Horn of Africa, Somalia, and Ethiopia. They've never received reparations even after the Italian invasion in Ethiopia. You look at the question of reparation for the people of Haiti. Did the people of Haiti as an African diaspora state receive the reparations? No. And hence today you see Haiti, it is in crisis. You look at the people of Jamaica, people of Barbados, Guyana. You come to the continent, like I said, the question of reparation, you even spoke about acknowledgement. You reminded me of the Germans in Namibia. What they did with the massacre of the Hereros and the Ovambo. They just came and said, no, we want to apologize. But there was no monetary compensation. The same question of the Queen of England, who have stolen minerals from this country, from South Africa. So there's reparation and restitution of cultural artifacts. For me, I would like the AU to read this theme, like reflect, deflect, to say, look back at that. The restitution of cultural artifacts is also important. But when you repair, also push for transitional justice. Because others won't agree to pay back what they've stolen from Africa. You know, so for me, the question of reparations, it's an international principle, it's an international law principle. But for the continent, and particularly in the SADC hemisphere, I think the SADC need to go after the former colonizers and ask for reparations. It might be a lengthy court trial, and reparations not even against former colonizers, multinationals, aided and abetted colonialism and apartheid.
South Africa chair the G20 in 2025. It's a big deal. for the continent. I am curious, A, about the dynamic of South Africa being in the G20 and then Africa through the African Union being in the G20. How does that work? Because it almost suggests South Africa is not part of the continent.
Yeah.
And what will this chairship do for the continent this year?
I think if we have to look at the chairpersonship and our membership as part of G20, the AU was during the chairpersonship of Comoros that we were able to pursue the G20. You might say we are G21, but it's still the G20. But South Africa's role there, I think it should represent the aspiration of Agenda 2063, Agenda 2050 of the SADC, and look at the regional economic bodies' interest. I mean, I'm very curious to say the G20 is more of an elitist debate because it's the bankers there. It's the financial institutions, it's the reserve bank governors who determines the issues of currency, the issues of development. Climate change will be the challenge to this G20 chairpersonship of South Africa, how to deal with the effects of climate change continentally and globally. The issues of peace and security that we've been raising, it will also be their challenge. The issue of the BRICS, Global South, pushing for their currency, and with the Trump 2.0 coming in, they'll have to manage even this delinquent president who's coming back again for the second term, how to deal with this delinquent anarchist and racist Donald Trump. Because America will also have an impact on this G20, the same like the EU member states. Hence I say to you, I sometimes say maybe South Africa needs to sanitize the G20 aims and objectives of 1999. Because for me, I see the G20 as the grouping of former colonizers of 1885 and 1884-1885 Berlin Conference, regrouping during the time of the, actually not 1999, it was 2009, just after the recession, the global meltdown. The G20 emerged, Brother Peter. I think for me, is if you can explain to ordinary South Africans, say, but what is this character called G20? Where does it come from? How did it emerge? And if South Africa is sharing, as you said, what are our profits? What are our benefits? How will it benefit ordinary South Africans, ordinary Africans? And we have taken that chairpersonship immediately towards the end of the year in 2024. So I think by now, we should find a way to say other members of the G20 are aware that South Africa is also influential in the BRICS countries in the global south as we are moving towards the multipolar world. For me, is that the G20 must be a multipolar forum, and the bankers and those financial institutions must deal with the African debt quickly, because you can't develop when you are still reeling from the debt. It means you are sitting on what Sankara said, perpetual foreign debt. You are sitting on a debt that will never erase. Right. And we have seen from the Sahel has moved out from the foreign debt of the former colonizers.
African Continental Free Trade Area and Agreement. It should be gaining momentum.
Absolutely.
Will we see the fruits, the first fruits, real fruits, coming through in 2020? Five.
I think Wamkele Mene coming from Accra must definitely push, because remember COVID-19 was the disruptor. But I think Wamkele Mene, there's one colleague of mine who has been trying to influence him on, you can't integrate Africa economically only, Brother Peter. You need to also use what I call the soft power, the cultural power of the continent. There are issues of dynamics when you are talking of trade. There are cultural nuisances when you talk of trade. There are issues of trust. I think the issue of trade also of the continent sits with the regional economic bodies, what you call the REX. And I think me and you have been complaining since we've engaged now, say ECOWAS, is it strong? East Africa Community, is it strong? IGAD, SADC, COMESA. We look at these regional economic bodies because I see them as the drivers of Africa Continental Free Trade. I see also African Continental Free Trade becoming a feature in the G20 chairpersonship of South Africa. I see it also questioning the World Bank and the IMF structural adjustment policies to the continent. Because Ghana has been borrowing money from the IMF, I don't know how many times. South Africa, we are indebted to the IMF. Ethiopia is indebted to the IMF. But the question of trade, I think, for the continent, it needs to be looked with the eye of the BRICS Global South Bloc. Because I think if you look at the BRICS Global South Bloc, whether China, Russia, Brazil, I think they are pushing a narrative of us being independent as we are getting into trade agreements, trade regulations, World Trade Organization. How do we even reform the World Trade Organization? How do we reform even our so-called banks in the continent? Because banks in the continent are still having their footprint from the West. So for me, when I look at Africa Continental Free Trade, in short, I say, let's use the power of culture also to integrate this beautiful continent.
We've run out of time, but one important question I've got to ask is, I did a story this morning, Global Peace Index, and it says that Sub-Saharan Africa is the second least peaceful region in the world, behind Middle East, North Africa, and that's saying quite a lot given what we're seeing. Will we improve that ranking this year?
I think we will, as you spoke about. Will we silence the guns by 2030 or by 2063? I think we will succeed if we have political maturity and commitment, and then we look at the issue of military solutions are not the only way to resolve conflicts in Africa. Military interventions, sanctions are not the solutions to the continent. I see the issue of empowerment of women and youth in terms of leadership. So that's how you can look at this question of not being peaceful, but how do we foster tolerance? I think the key issue is that the member states of the AU, of the UN, have to build this culture of peace in the minds of men and women. And for me, is that, again, conflict or war, Brother Peter, it's a business. We should never miss that point. For other people, when there is no conflict, they see losses in the African continent. But I assume that Africa will know peace one day, as Robert Nesta Marley will be turning 80 years this year in 2025. Robert Nesta Marley spoke about the unity of the continent and knowing peace and knowing what Peter Tosh will have said, equal rights and justice for the African continent. So for me, those are the issues that embodies 2025 and looking forward with not pessimism, but optimism. Being optimistic that Africa will rise, and Africa is rising. And hopefully the issues that you are raising in terms of the Sub-Sahara not being peaceful, it will definitely be a peaceful region moving forward, because it also has natural resources. That's what it becomes a curse and a blessing.
I definitely have run out of time. I'm probably going to get into trouble. But Africa has the resources. This is where civilization began.
Absolutely.
I'm hoping that we will, in 2025, start to increase our global influence and take our own power. Is that something that we might see to happen?
Absolutely. We have done it in 2024 by taking Israel to the ICJ, and I think 2025, we might continue with the same case. Africa might also appear before this G20, and also at the UN General Assembly. We still have influence when you have the member states, presidents going there. So I still feel that we are going to have a global influence, because Africa, it is part of the globe, and without Africa there is no world. It's the same the question of without DRC there is no world, because of the natural resources DRC has. So for me, I see the positive outlook for the continent in terms of our influence, and we need capable thinkers, philosophers, technocrats, diplomats, media analysts, media anchors, to give a positive image about Africa, because I think we've been having a challenge of who reports about Africa, who covers Africa, and what is the agenda around it. So for me, the outlook, it also lies in the camera, it also lies in the mic, it also lies in the papers, in the text of how do we report and vision the beautiful continent.
Phil Molifa once said to me, yes, it's good to do positive stories, but you can't paint trees green during a drought.
Absolutely, you can't. It is like this said of Mali saying, it's like you are barking at a flying bird. Look at this dog barking at a flying
Yes.
bird. So for me is that Africa must know
Yeah.
its position and its citizens, and hence the question of the media ethics of reporting the continent. Report both good and bad, but always try to raise hopes and expectations to the present generations, because we are sitting with the present generations that they are always looking at Dubai, they are always looking at New York, at France. You know, they don't have an image of Addis Ababa, an image of Lusaka, the image of Sudan. It is the issue of what I call media negligence, but it can be corrected with the current crop of anchors like you, Brother Peter, that you have been on this game for many years, and you know the agency and the emergency of the Africa we will want to see in 2063.
We'll continue the good fight. Advocate Sipho Mantula, always a pleasure talking to you. Your insights greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Asante sana.
Thank you.
Ke a leboga.
And that's how we come to the end of today's edition of Channel Africa Conversations. Thanks for tuning in. Before I disappear, though, we'd love to hear from you on our social media platforms. They're on the screen now. To share with us your thoughts about what you've heard, and also maybe conversations that you want us to have and the people you want us to put in this chair. Please comment in the comment section below so that we can start having those conversations together. All right, until the next time, have a great 2025.